Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak here today. Yeah, Elena Suarez-Konoa unfortunately can't be here with me today because we had sort of a meeting conflict with dates. So, and I have to say that Elena is my PhD student in the project, so she's actually doing all the work. So I will be telling you more about the great lines, the grand lines of this project. And so I'm talking about unraveling romantic communication in the sense of early Romanticism, the literary epoch in end of 18th, beginning of 19th century in, let's say, Central Europe in the whole. And especially about correspondence networks of these early Romanticists. And from the perspective of digital humanities, and given that we are now 2 years into a project that we have been planned for 6 years, our data is not really yet in the state that we want it to be in the end and that we want it to be for the final analysis. So right now, unraveling romantic communication for me means mainly unraveling our data. Its perspectives, its, let's say, pitfalls, and to reflect on how we can analyze these data, which are very complex, which are incomplete, which have many layers, with computational methods. So I will try to do that in 5 steps. First, I want to introduce to you the project, Correspondence of Early Romanticism. I want to talk a bit about knowledge management, because we're building a knowledge graph in the project, how we want to enrich the knowledge graph with further data. Then about our first steps in the direction of network research, and finally an outlook and sort of a conclusion. So the project has this subtitle, Editing, Annotating Network Research, and that basically tells you all you need to know what we want to do in the project. First, the basic information. So this is the DFG project. We've started in the mid of 2022. We have been the project has been granted for 3 years, and we hope to have an additional grant for 3 years that we're just working on. And we have 3 project partners: the literary scholars who are editing the letters, who are sitting at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz. My team at the Academy of Sciences and Literature in Mainz, which is Elena and our student assistant Clara, and a third group at the Trier Center of Digital Humanities at the University of Trier. And the aims of are to study these communications processes as they are expressed in the letters between the different persons who are making up what we call early romantics in Jena and Berlin. The early romanticism was sort of an intellectual revolution. It was mainly driven by a group of authors, scholars, philosophers in Jena, but also in Berlin. And we are focusing on this time between 790 and 1802. In 1802, Novalis died, who was one of the most important actors. So this is a definite break in the development of this group. And to study these communication processes, but also knowledge transfer and group dynamics, we want to make these correspondences of central actors, but also of some marginal figures, digital accessible and reusable in open access. And we also want to conduct research on these letters, qualitative and quantitative. And their digital humanities and literary studies are supposed to work together, and we are already working together, of course. This is our website, which went online earlier this year. Here you see one of our typical objects of study. This is a letter from Sophie Bernhardi to August Wilhelm von Schlegel. You can see on the left, you can see the letter, the text, metadata. Then we also have annotations. You can see in the text, like persons, places, works, institutions, and periodicals. Yeah, and this website is done by our colleagues in Trier. And here I've brought a little schematic to show you how the tasks are divided in the project. So red is everything the University of Mainz is doing, so our editors who are obviously editing the letters. Then at the University of Trier, they have built this virtual research environment. They're using a software that they have developed for a long time, which is called FUD. I unfortunately have forgotten what it stands for, but you can easily find it. And they're also doing the website and a work package in semantic similarity. And at the Academy, we built from the data that we export from FUD, we're building a knowledge graph that we want to enrich, and then we want to use that as a basis for network research. And so the first step for us was knowledge management, to build an ontology for these letters. CER is sort of the abbreviation for the English title, Communication, Early Romanticism, and the knowledge graph. And I think for knowledge management, this is a very interesting quote when we think about knowledge management, what this means in the humanities. Because what we, to study something like the romantic correspondences with computational method, this requires that this phenomenon is first expressed or represented as data structures. And of course, these data structures follow very different rules as traditional forms of representing and studying cultural objects. So to make them, as Lev Manovich here says in this quote, computable, manageable, knowable, and shareable, we have to make a series of decisions, ideally guided by our research interests or questions. And for example, as he says here, which objects do we want to study, what features are added, and how we encode all these objects and features. And these decisions, of course, have lots of implications. So this is the ontology that we're working on. Obviously, it's an iterative process. That means every time we go into the data or we add more data, we have to redo the whole process or go through the process again. And our main leading question is, what do we understand as a letter in the project, and how can we encode this understanding in data structures? And we have referenced ontologies such as the CDOC-CRM. I don't know if anyone here knows it. It's like an ontology for cultural heritage. The basic formal ontology, which is an upper ontology, and we've also referenced the TI Correspondence desk guidelines. The TI is for annotating text in XML. So the TI guidelines are less an ontology, but really guidelines, but of course, very important for us in the humanities. And so this ontology, obviously there are very many different ways to look at letters and to analyze letters or to study letters. And here you can see the two main components that we are analyzing. Something that we've called the real world. These are still work in progress terms, but which are mainly concerned with the acts of sending and receiving letters. And the letter world, so the world that opens up in the content of these letters, where persons and places and works and everything else are mentioned, where they are being talked about. Also, we have this work package about statements. This will come up in the presentation once or twice, or Connexion, they're calling it, but I will not go further into detail on this, because if I would probably have to talk like half an hour more. And so I decided to leave that out in this presentation. Yeah, we also have serialized this ontology in OWL, so you can look at that here, and we are updating it as we go. And this ontology is sort of the blueprint of our knowledge graph, and we are currently in the process of enriching it with further data. I will show that in the next step. And right now, our knowledge graph is a Neo4j graph database, but in the next project phase, we want to transform it into a triple store and then also make it queryable for people who are not in the project. Yeah, and this is the letter from Sophie Bernhardi, which you just saw as, you know, the letter readable for humans, and this is it as a graph representation. So when we look at the current state of our data, our knowledge graph right now has almost 200,000 data points. So at first glance, when we see these numbers, we're like, yes, This is a lot. We can do a lot of quantitative analysis with that. But then we take a closer look at the data. And this is very exemplary for humanities data. You have this seemingly mass of data, but it breaks down into very little divides. And we have all these types of nodes, we have all these types of edges. We have almost 50,000 mentions that are annotated of persons, places, etc. But if we look at the numbers here, then we see that this is mainly persons and works that are mentioned a lot, and we do not have that many places, and we have like 114 institutions. Yeah? So if we would focus on institutions, we would have to think about if this is this data that warrants a quantitative analysis, or what sort of analysis do we want to do? How do we want to look at that? What benefit can quantitative or formal analysis, let's leave out the quantitative, formal analysis give us on this data? That is an interesting information. We're talking about almost 5,400 letters right now. So, and also for this sort of this complexity that opens up in these different types of nodes and edges, of course, also the ontology is sort of a map for that for us, to see how to always keep reminding us how this is exactly is connected. So what we want to do next is what we're working on right now is to enrich the knowledge graph and to add more context to the data, because of course letters have a very restricted perspective. For example, people who are at the same time, at the same place, will not write letters to each other, even if they have a very strong connection. So that is like the most famous example. And we're using norm data for that. So most of the persons in our database have a GMD number. I don't know if you know the GMD. It's the integrated authority file of the German National Library that they're collecting there. And the German National Library doesn't only give out these GMD IDs, but they also connect the different entities. And so we are querying additional information from this database. Right now, we're focusing on gender and familial relationships. Why do we do that? Well, first of all, this data is missing in our database. So, for example, gender is not gathered as an attribute in our data. But we do want to focus on data feminist approaches, so it would be pretty good to have that attribute. And we want to spotlight relations between people connected to the letters. So, of course, this whole endeavor allows us to add context outside of our project scopes or resources. So this is, for me, sort of the promise of linked open data, that because, as you know, I think it's the same in informatics or in computer science. In the humanities, we always have not enough people and not enough money. And so this idea, we can just query the GMD and get all this information that someone else has collected for us, of course, is very, sounds very nice. But of course, for that, there comes a lot of problems. For example, right now we're working on these familial relations, and the first question is, how do we integrate that in our ontology? And I've brought here two examples. On the left is how the CDOC models relationships, and they're focusing on parents and spouses, these sorts of relations, because they say everything else can be deduced from that. And on the right is a model presented in this paper, formal ontology, an ontology for formal models of kinship. And they add a sibling relationship and a half-sibling relationship. So the question for us is which model to use. And here we have a conflict between sparsity, as presented by the CDOC and the reality of the data. Because the reality of the data is that the GND very often has familial relations such as second cousin. And this is, of course, something we cannot deduce or we cannot map on this sort of model. So first is the question is, first of all, what sorts of data do we even use from that data that the GND can offer us? And then how do we integrate it exactly in our ontology and in our database? Other challenges are more of conceptual nature. For example, with gender, of course, if we draw gender data on gender from the GND, then we are constrained by the logic that the GND gives us. And the logic of the GND is that gender is a binary, and there is, of course, the question if that is really what we want in the project. I think this is not, or I hope this won't be too relevant for our project, but for example, if you would have more modern projects, it would be a big problem. We researched some individuals who have transgender identities or who are gender fluid or non-binary, and those are all misgendered in the GND. So this data enrichment is very fascinating experiment to us, but obviously there are a lot of challenges. One, it's very time consuming because it's this iterative process of first analyzing the structure of the external data. Okay, the second part is for a slide that I had to cut because of time, so ignore that. Then we have to conceptualize and update our ontology. Then we have to get the data and add it to the knowledge graph, which also takes time. And then, of course, we have to analyze it and interpret it. So, and also all this has to be done through a critical lens. There's this paper by Jeremy Huggett about slow data and datafication, actually in archaeology, but I think it works very well for historical data as well. And he talks about how the merging or aggregating of different databases together requires a host of simplifications that we have to make. And also that here we are trying to align data that are difficult to align because the purpose of recalling this data were totally different. The GND had a very different aim in collecting this data than we have with our project, and we sort of have to come to terms with these different purposes. And so he says that, I just put the whole quote in red because I couldn't decide what was the most important part here. Any patterns observed from this data arise through a combination of these, the sets of layers of abstractions, reductions, and standardizations. Yeah, and this sort of warning by Huggett, of course, applies even more so to analyzing these data with formal analysis methods such as network research. But this is what we want to do. We want to analyze communication networks, and we want to analyze knowledge production and transfer. And in the following, there are some of the ideas we're right now developing and the challenges these ideas bring with them. So I cannot emphasize enough that these are our first steps in this. So for the last 6 months, we have started to delve into network analysis, but we have been doing all the other tasks at the same time. So this has been slow going, though we already do have some results. And this is mainly done by Laura Fahrt, who works at the University of Mainz, and Elena, who works with me. And they're also doing their PhD projects on a combination of literary studies and digital humanities. I didn't want to try to translate these titles in English, but basically, if I break it down, Elena is working on the functions and the roles and everything that are evident in correspondences by women. And Laura is working on friendship in a romantic context, which is also very interesting because the first question is what is friendship, and the second question is what is friendship in romanticism. So, and the third might be what is friendship in romanticism in networks. Yeah, but again, the caveat, our data collection is still ongoing and still in the very early stages. So right now, the current state of our analysis and our data reflects very clearly whose letters we have already collected in the project so far, which are these 5 people: August Wilhelm von Schlegel, his brother Friedrich von Schlegel, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was a philosopher, Caroline von Schelling, former Michaelis, former Böhmer, former von Schlegel. She was married to August Wilhelm Schlegel at the time of the letters, and Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was also a philosopher. And for these editions of letters, we have the metadata and annotations of the text, so works, person, space, etc. We only have for the letters by August Wilhelm Schlegel, which of course constrains our analytic potentials and capabilities. And that's why we're right now focusing on the development of methodology to analyze our research questions based on our project-specific data and data configurations, and not so much on final results. And Elena and Laura are currently working on the communication networks. This is the sender-receiver network of the data that we have so far. So the goal here is to obviously highlight important actors in these correspondences, to identify groups, maybe to also search for signs of loss or reestablishment of contact, and put all these factors in a temporal and comparative context. I'm not going to say too much about that because they're just working on it and they are preparing a publication that will hopefully be out at the end of the year. But what we already see very clearly is that the persons that I just mentioned from which we have the metadata are the dominating nodes in this network. We do have some other interesting nodes, like for example, here is Diecke, Goethe, Schelling, and here is Schiller, which I didn't find the last time. There's also Novalis. So we can already see how these different correspondence circuits overlap, which is super interesting. For example, Schleiermacher is pretty much to the side and not so much connected by these minor actors. And what is also sort of interesting is that there are two other big nodes that are not these persons, which are Dorothea von Schlegel, the wife of Friedrich von Schlegel, and Johanna Fichte, the wife of the male Fichte, Johann. So there are already, we can already see that there are main correspondence partners that are starting to emerge, and we hope that this picture will grow and become more comprehensive as we collect more data. Just the gender of persons that we have in our database, and the persons in our database are persons who have sent letters, who have received letters, or who are mentioned in the letters. Of course, there are some problems because sometimes the people mentioned are something like Frau Müller, or you give greetings to your sister, and so we can't identify all of the persons, and not all of them have been identified and have their own ID, but so far that they're identifiable, we are trying to identify them. I mean, this is always a problem with these historical or when you're trying to formalize this sort of data, that of course there is a sort of border where a limit where a group becomes not identifiable and not, yeah, so. So this graph, despite it being very early, is nevertheless very interesting to us because it sort of teaches us what to ask from the graph and what not. Because even if we have more people, the correspondences of more people, we will still have this basic bias that you see here. We will not have these correspondences of all these people that appear here. We will have maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 persons. So this bias that is very visible now might be less visible and might even be hidden, but it will still be there. So it's for us very important to look at this data where the bias is very, very strongly represented and think about what that means for our analysis. And so the second big subject that we're looking at is knowledge production and transfer. And here, there are just several approaches that we're just trying out. We actually just had a workshop 2 weeks ago where we talked about how we can approach this. So everything I'm showing you now is has even more of an experimental nature and just basically playing around with the data and with networks. And one possible approach that we identified was focusing on the influence and the discourses around specific important works or work complexes, let's call them. And one of these cases is the works of Shakespeare, because one of the big projects of August Wilhelm von Schlegel and Caroline von Schlegel was a translation of the works of Shakespeare. And both of them were very involved in this work, and it took a long time, so is very present in their letters as well. And the questions that we have here is, for example, in what sort of environment did these translations develop, and who talked about Shakespeare, how did they talk about him, about which of his works did they talk. There are several different layers of works we have in this data set. There are the works themselves, there are translations of the works, and there are reviews of the works and of the translations. And so on these different layers, we can analyze who talked about what in which context together with what, and so on. And in the end, I think the idea that we have here is to think about what sort of thought space were these people in when they did these translations, and what sort of influences influenced the translations. And again, I want to emphasize that right now the data is only from the correspondences of August Wilhelm Schlegel, so letters from him and to him. So we're working on his letters, creating or thinking of possible network models that we can use to analyze this data. But of course, we're already keeping in mind which results they might bring if we add other correspondences, especially the correspondences, of course, of Caroline. Okay, so when we see what we already have in data, then we have actually 621 mentions of works of Shakespeare in our corpus. But if we break it down, then again, that reasonable big data is fragmented by its complexity. We see that these 621 mentions are 271 letters and are actually of 73 works. And then if we look further, which works were mentioned as how much, then we see that these mentions are mostly driven by the dramatic works of Shakespeare, which were translated by August Wilhelm and Caroline von Schlegel, which is not registered here because officially, on the official book, just his name was written. And also these dramatic works are broken down into several parts. So sometimes they talked about the whole complex, sometimes they talked about different parts. So they make up the main mass of the mentions. Yeah, and then one possible approach here is, of course, who wrote to whom about Shakespeare, who talked to whom about his works, these translations. Of course, this is a star network because it's now the correspondences of August Wilhelm. But what we already see here is that we have some structure here, and that is because very often the Romantics would write to wouldn't just write to one person, but to several persons, and also the other way around. Because August Wilhelm Schlegel, Caroline Schlegel, Friedrich von Schlegel, Dorothea von Schlegel, and Schelling all lived in the same house at some certain points in time. Not at this time. At this time, August Wilhelm and Caroline's daughter Auguste from a former marriage lived together in Jena, and Friedrich and Dorothea lived in Berlin. But so they often wrote letters that were addressed at several people. And right now, in the analysis, we're going like the traditional work of the traditional way of historical network research, which is, okay, so these letters are, if there's one letter to 3 people, that's 3 edges. But of course, that would be something that when we have bigger data, we could start analyzing, like co-authorship of letters, co-receivership of letters, something like that. But right now, the data is not. Yeah, but what's obviously interesting here for us are things like frequency. How often did people write? And also reciprocity. Did August Wilhelm actually answer these letters? Of course, there's another problem here that we do not have all the letters. Many people in historical times destroyed their letters or wanted their letters destroyed. Some wanted to have kept them all. So this is also a source bias that we always have to keep in mind. And because we just talked about the years, another idea, of course, would be to analyze the dynamics of this discourse. So to to take this network apart into slices of a year, for example. Now we come into the realm of qualitative network analysis. because as you see in the table on the left, there are not so many letters per year. This is the network of 1797, where we actually have 66 letters, and or 66 edges, because as we see the colored edges, if they have the same color, they denote the same letter. And so here we see this phenomenon very clearly. August Wilhelm wrote to, Friedrich von Schlegel wrote to August Wilhelm and Caroline at the same time, or he wrote to August Wilhelm, Caroline, and Augusta at the same time. And also August Wilhelm wrote, and August Wilhelm and Caroline also wrote letters to the same persons together. So yeah, this would actually be really interesting to look at a bigger scale. Yeah, but this qualitative approach for us also is very interesting because for once, for our partner from literary studies, of course, this is much more accessible and answers much more to the questions that they might have, which are more qualitative in nature. And to us, it's also very interesting because on this micro level, data problems become much more evident, which would sort of disappear in the big graph. This is, of course, the question that I now mentioned a couple of times, several authors or recipients of letters, but it's also messy data, because as you can see here in the red part, here we have a normalization error. Carl Gustav Brinkmann, Carl Gustav von Brinkmann, and despite being very, very careful, these things still happen, and so this is also an iterative process where we analyze this data and then we go back into our editing virtual research environment and do corrections, and then we go back. So, and all these analyses obviously will be super interesting when we have more data on Caroline's letters as well, because then we will be able to compare how was August Wilhelm's network structured, how was her network structured, does it overlap, how is the dynamics and everything. Another approach is this, what I already said, can be identified sort of thought spaces that these people were in while they were doing these translations. So did they have common reference points or shared influences? In this case, between August Wilhelm Schlegel and his correspondence partners. And so this is a co-occurrence network of works. This is a co-occurrence network of works mentioned in letters in which works by Shakespeare were also mentioned, or translations of works of Shakespeare's, or reviews of works or translations, without the works by Shakespeare, so because they would obviously be most central. And what I did here is I just did a Louvre clustering, so very easy. And if you look, for example, I looked at this gray group because it's the most central in the graph. And here you see that the highest rated degree of these in this Louvre group 3 is the Don Quixote by Cervantes, who was also translated by Ludwig Tieck, so also his translation works, and about the history of poetry and discussions of Shakespeare's work. Yeah, and this is the point where I do have to give that to the literary scholars, because the next step would obviously be to look at the different Louvre groups, to think about what is the common denominator, how are the groups different, then maybe think about who was connected to these groups of co-occurring works. And this is obviously something that someone should do who knows a lot more about the Romantic period than I do. But our strategy is sort of to take all these approaches that I've shown you together, to work in the qualitative and the quantitative, to switch between micro, meso, and macro layers. And together allows us to look at the data from all sorts of different perspectives and angles and gain more context and insight into the specifics of our data set. So I already ran a little bit late, but I answered some questions, so I will try to wrap it up a little bit. So what do we want to do in the next 4 years? So we still have 1 more year in the project, and then hopefully 3 years more. Obviously, we want to add more data, and then we want to add that data to the knowledge graph to get a more comprehensive picture. We want to update our ontology accordingly. We also want to explore reasoning approaches with the ontology in a very simple, and then maybe a bit more complicated. And then we want to work in an iterative process on these analyses, observe also how the output changes when we get more data, which I think will be very interesting. Delve deeper into interpretations and further refine our network methodology. Now, our leading question is sort of how we can adapt and contextualize these methods and algorithms of quantitative analysis to arrive at insightful, stable, and non-misleading results to our specific research questions on our specific data. So I hope I could give you some insights in our project and how we sort of unravel correspondences of early Romanticism. Show you a little bit where the chances and the challenges are of these approaches to this sort of data, how to represent it as data structures, how to develop an awareness of these simplifications that go with this process, and show you how we approach this challenge of applying formal analysis methods to what Cooper and Green call characterful data, and work of finding different ways to analyze these complexes of communication and knowledge transfer, while still respecting this complexity and context and richness of these sources. For me, actually, the big question for historical and humanities data in general is if we can sort of find a middle way between big data, which we obviously do not have, and slow data or data mindfulness, which focuses on a very qualitative analysis. So a middle ground for these medium-sized data sets as we have them. And therefore, let me close with a quote by Ruth and Sebastian Arnett, Scott Weingart, and Nicole Coleman from their book, The Network Turn, where they say that in the context of humanities, the bias in the source data is often itself a scholar. So they argued that this bias should not be seen as an error or a fault in the data that has to be taken out, but more as a perspective that makes out this specific data set. And that remains in this data set no matter what we do. And they say that articulating humanities network data in these terms as a perspective rather than this sort of bias or fault will be a grand challenge for the next generation of researchers in this area. And this is basically the challenge that we are trying to unravel. With that, thank you very much for your attention. If you have questions, you can always write me or you can ask me. Thank you very much.